Hi, I'm Revanth. This is part 28 of a web services video series. In this session, we will discuss perform a check for roles of a user in web service. Important synopsis we will discuss in this video are: create a web service to check the roles of user. Based upon the client user credentials, web service should perform a check to verify the roles of a user from the database and to return the response. Consume the created web service in client application. So let's begin the tutorial. If you haven't watched my previous videos, I strongly recommend to watch before proceeding this video. In part 25, I have discussed differences between web reference and service reference. In part 26, custom SOAP header request in web service. In part 27, I have discussed how to return JSON and XML response from web service. Flow to check the roles of user. When the client user sends a request to the web service will perform a check from the database. If the user credentials are valid, then it will return the roles of the user. Let's create web service and to check the roles of user. Let's flip to Visual Studio. Let's click on File, New, Website. Let's select template as Visual C# and .NET Framework as 4.5 and select ASP.NET Empty Website. Rename the project as User Roles in Web Service. Click on OK button. Once the project is created, let's right click on the project, click on add new item, select web services, rename it as service.asmx, click on add button. That will create the web service. Now let's rename Hello World to get user roles. Let's pass the parameters as string, username, comma, string password. Now let's select class file and rename it as user response. Click on OK button. Now this is the default constructor. Now let's create a properties. Data type is string and we have to create the user roles. And one more property, string response message. And last property, string response status. Let's format this. This is the constructor. These are the properties. Properties, constructor, and the instance variables. Now let's right click on the app_code folder and select class file and rename it as user. Click on OK button. Now let's create one method. Public user response is the return type, and validate user. Which takes two input parameters. Username and the password. Now let's create a constructor for this user response. Now let's write a connection to the database. Let's try within the catch block. Now in the try block, let's create user ID equal to 0 and string roles equal to string dot empty. Connection string equal to configuration manager. This is in the namespace system.configuration dot connection string of, we have to specify the name of the connection string here, dot toString. Using SQL connection this is in the namespace system.data.sql client. Let's import that. Connection equal to new SQL connection of, we have to pass this connection string here. Let's copy and paste here. Now we have to create the SQL connection command. We have totally 4 overload methods here. One is without parameter, other is we have to pass the command string command string and the connection, and the last is connection. We have to specify the transaction. Validate user. This is a stored procedure. We will discuss later in the meanwhile. While we are creating the database, we will discuss what is this validate user and how to pass the parameters. cmd dot command type equal to command type. This is in system.data namespace dot. This is stored procedure, so we have to specify this is stored procedure. After that, we have to pass the parameters to the database. In what way? We have to pass the parameters in add cmd dot parameters dot add with value. So along with the string, we can pass the object value here. So let's specify the parameter name. We have to pass this username here. Let's copy paste. One more parameter, cmd dot parameters dot add with value. We have to pass the password. Let's copy paste this password. Now we have to pass the connection string SQL connection to the cmd SQL command. So what we have to do, cmd dot connection equal to connection. Now we have to open the connection dot open. Now we have to execute cmd dot execute reader. Why we have to take this execute reader means we are getting some value from the database. What is those values means user ID and the roles. Now when we look at the here, the return type of this cmd dot execute reader is SQL data reader. So let's create SQL data reader here. Create the object is reader dot read. So that will read out the values returned from database. We have to retrieve those values from this reader object. So how we have to read? Reader of the value which is returning from the database is user ID. Let's convert this as convert.to int 32. That will convert the string value as integer. We have to store those value in user ID. Let's copy and paste here, and we have to retrieve the roles. We have to pass the value here within the roles. Now let's close the connection here. Connection dot close. Now we have to pass the values to this user response object. Because the return type is user response, we have to pass the values and we have to retrieve from user response object. So for that we have to pass the user ID and the roles, return new method here, and we need one more parameter as user response. So no need of creating the constructor here one more time. For that, user response is the parameter. Let's take this object, pass here. Now let's remove this. Now let's write one switch condition to check the user ID. If the return value user ID is equal to -1, so we have to return the response and the message has user response dot user role has null, and we have to pass the response status. When you go back to the class we have created, user response, here we have created my property. We have not renamed it as response status. Let's go back, and we have to pass the fail to this response status and invalid credentials for this response message if the value user ID is equal to -1, which has retrieved from database. To speed things up, I have created this. So these are the instant variables. For failure, I have created this failure, and for success, this invalid credentials means username and the password is incorrect, and if we got any internal server error like the catch block, it will be internal server failure. Now let's create default for this switch condition. If the user does not equal to case 1, it comes to default condition, and within this condition we are returning the role to this user role, and the response status has success and the response message has null. Now we have to return this object. Now within the catch block we have to return this response. Response status has failed, and if we comes to this catch block we have to return the response message as internal server error. Now let's go back to the services.cs file, and let's rename it as return type is user response. User dot let's create a constructor for this user object. User dot we have validate user. We have to pass the username and the password. Now let's build the solution. So build succeeded. Let's put a breakpoint here, and once it goes to this method, so that's it, we have done the service. Now let's create a DB database. Now let's flip to SQL Server database. Let's right click on the database and create new database, user roles DB. Click on OK button. That will create the database for us. Now to speed things up, I have already written the script file. Let's copy and paste. Here I am creating one user table. Within that user table, the columns are user ID, username, password, email, created date, last login date, role ID. And here the roles are, I have created like role ID and the role name. So this is the foreign key I have referenced in user table. Execute this table first. So command executed successfully. Let's now let's execute this table now. So we have two tables. Let's refresh and open. We have created roles and the user table. Now let's execute this insert script in the roles DB. Rows executed successfully. Now let's execute this both script in a user table. As one is admin user and other is like Revanth, normal user. Let's execute. Now when we execute these both tables, we get the role ID, role name has a administrator and the user. Here within the user table, we have admin and the Revanth. Now let's execute this store procedure. This store procedure name is validate user, which takes input parameters as username and the password. So I'm declaring the variables user ID, last login date and the role ID. So these are the return values, user ID and the role ID. So I am selecting from the user table. The selected value is user ID, last login date and the role ID. When the username and the password matches, if user ID is not null, means user exists. If at that time I am updating the user last login date and I am selecting the user ID, and from roles table I am selecting the role. I am returning that role user ID and the role ID if the user is valid. If the user is invalid, I am returning as -1. So let's execute this stored procedure. So command executed successfully. So now let's execute. This stored procedure name. Let's pass the two input parameters, username and the password. Admin comma password has 123. So we have got the user ID and the roles successfully. So by executing this stored procedure, we can able to retrieve the user ID and the roles. Now let's go back to web services. Here we have to make the connection string here. Now let's right click on the data connections. Let's click on add connections. Within that, we have to select the Microsoft SQL Server and click on continue button. So server name is, this is the local server. We can give the local server name as dot, and we have to pass the username and the password here. Now let's retrieve the data. Database name is user roles db. Click on test connection. So test connection succeeded. Let's click on OK button. Now let's go to the properties and take this connection string. Let's copy and paste it in web.config. Now let's create a connection string here. Add connection string. We have to take the name of the connection string as user string db. Let's give the connection string as what we have copied, this one. Let's rename the password. Now connection string is ready for us. Let's build the solution, run the project. Let's click on this get user roles. We need to pass the username and the password credentials. Let's pass the username as admin and password has 123. Click on invoke button. So we got the admin and the password, username and the password. So it goes to the validate user method. Internal server failure. Oh, this is because we have not given the connection string here. We have not given the connection string here. Let's go back to web.config. Let's copy and paste this connection string name. Let's rerun the project. Let's pass username and the password. So connection, we have got the connection string. Let's continue. So we have validate user stored procedure. We are passing the username and the password to that stored procedure. So connection opened and executed and read user ID is 1. So that is a valid user. We got the role as administrator. Let's continue. So it comes to the switch condition, and this is user ID is 1. That means user is valid user. So it goes to the default switch method switch condition and returns the response as roles as a username and status as success. Let's continue. So that gives the response status as success and user role as administrator. Now let's pass invalid user like something user ID. So let's click on continue. So we got the response like user ID as -1. It goes to this case of 1 condition. And it returns the status as fail and user credentials as invalid. Response status is fail and we got the response message as username and the password is incorrect. So by this way we have to pass the username and the password to the web service. So we have to authenticate the user credentials and we have to get the role ID as the response. So by this way we have to create the service to retrieve the role ID based upon the user credentials. If anyone wants this database script and the project module, so mail to this below ID. But don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. In next video we will discuss transport layer security in web services. Thanks for watching. For references and resources visit these links and subscribe to my YouTube channel for email alerts. Thank you.